I never thought I'd be sharing these stories with anyone, but after what happened to me and my friends, I feel like I have to get this out there. Maybe it will help someone else avoid what we went through, or maybe it will just serve as a warning. These 3 incidents happened to me over the span of 2 years, and they've changed the way I think about being alone at night forever. The first incident happened when I was 22, living in a small apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building in downtown. My roommate Sarah had gone to visit her parents for the weekend, leaving me alone for 3 days. I remember being excited about having the place to myself, planning to catch up on some shows and just relax. The apartment was in a decent neighborhood, and I'd never had any problems before. That Friday night started like any other. I ordered pizza, settled into the couch, and was halfway through a movie when I heard the first knock dot. It was around 10:30, and the knock was soft, almost hesitant. I paused the movie and listened, thinking maybe I'd imagined it. Then it came again, 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the front door. I looked through the peephole but saw nothing except the dimly lit hallway. The fluorescent light at the end of the corridor was flickering, casting dancing shadows that made me feel uneasy. I called out asking who it was, but got no response. After waiting a few minutes, I went back to my movie, convincing myself it was probably just someone who had the wrong apartment. 20 minutes later, the knocking came again. This time it was different, more insistent. 5 quick knocks, then a pause, then 5 more. I muted the TV and crept to the door, my heart starting to race. Again, I looked through the peephole and saw nothing. The hallway was empty, but something felt wrong. The flickering light at the end seemed to be casting shadows that moved independently of its rhythm. I pressed my ear to the door and heard what sounded like someone breathing heavily just on the other side. When I called out again, the breathing stopped immediately. I decided to call the building security, but when I picked up my phone, I realized I didn't have their number. The building was old and didn't have a proper concierge service. I thought about calling my neighbor across the hall, Mrs. Chun, an elderly woman who'd been living there for years. But it was getting late, and I didn't want to disturb her if this was just someone playing a prank. Instead, I double-checked all the locks and went back to the couch. Though I kept the volume low so I could hear if anything else happened, the 3rd round of knocking came at exactly midnight. I know because I'd been checking the time obsessively. Every few minutes. This time, the pattern was different again. 7 slow knocks, each one seeming to echo through the apartment. But what terrified me wasn't just the knocking, it was what I heard between the knocks. A voice, barely above a whisper, saying my name. Not Sarah's name, not a generic greeting, but my actual name. The voice was hoarse and strained, like someone who'd been screaming for hours. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but as I was about to press call, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the knocking itself. I could feel someone's presence on the other side of the door, waiting. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the couch with a kitchen knife, watching the door and jumping at every small sound the old building made. When morning came, I worked up the courage to look through the peephole again. The hallway was empty, but there was something on the floor right in front of my door. I waited until I heard Mrs. Chun leaving for her morning walk before I opened the door. On the floor was a small piece of paper folded in half. With shaking hands, I picked it up and read what was written inside. It was my full name, address, and phone number, written in shaky handwriting. But underneath that, in the same handwriting, were the words, "I know you're alone." I immediately called Sarah and begged her to come back early. When she arrived that evening, I showed her the note. She suggested we report it to the police, but what could I tell them? Someone knocked on my door and left a note with my information. They'd probably think I was paranoid, but that wasn't the end of it. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing things. Small things at first. Items in my apartment would be moved slightly. A book I'd left on the coffee table would be on the kitchen counter. The remote control would be in the bedroom when I was sure I'd left it in the living room. Sarah didn't notice anything, and I started to wonder if I was losing my mind. Maybe the stress of that night had affected me more than I realized. Then one evening, while Sarah was at work, I was in the shower when I heard the front door close. I called out, thinking Sarah had come home early, but got no response. I quickly finished my shower, wrapped a towel around myself, and went to check. The apartment was empty, and the door was still locked from the inside. But sitting on the kitchen counter was a cup of coffee, still steaming. I hadn't made any coffee that day. I called Sarah immediately, and she rushed home. When she arrived, the cup was still there, though it had cooled down. She was as confused as I was, but she tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had made coffee and forgotten about it. Maybe I was sleepwalking, but I knew something was wrong. That night, I barely slept, and when I did, I dreamed about someone sitting in my kitchen, watching me sleep. The next morning, I found a spare key missing from the key bowl by the door. It was a key I'd given to my friend Marcus months ago, but he'd returned it when he moved to another city. I was sure I'd put it back in the bowl, but now it was gone. I had the locks changed that same day, not telling Sarah the real reason why. I just said I wanted to upgrade the security dot, but changing the locks didn't help. The incidents continued. I'd come home to find windows open that I was certain I'd closed. Food would be missing from the refrigerator. Once, I found muddy footprints on the bathroom floor, size 11 boots when I wore size 8 shoes. Sarah never saw any of these things, and she was starting to think I was having some kind of breakdown. The situation reached its peak about a month after the first night of knocking. I was alone again, Sarah having gone to spend the night at her boyfriend's place. I was in bed, trying to read, when I heard the shower turn on. At first, I thought maybe it was a plumbing issue, but then I heard something that made my blood run cold. Someone was humming in the shower, a low, toneless humming that seemed to go on forever. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the bathroom. The door was closed, but I could see light coming from underneath it. The humming continued, occasionally interrupted by what sounded like someone washing their hair. I stood there for what felt like hours, paralyzed by fear. Finally, I worked up the courage to try the door handle. It was locked from the inside. I called the police immediately. When they arrived, they found the bathroom empty. The shower was dry, and there was no sign that anyone had been in there. The window was too small for anyone to escape through, and besides, we were on the 3rd floor. The officers looked at me with pity and suggested I might want to talk to someone about stress. After they left, I packed a bag and went to stay with my friend Jennifer for a few weeks. When I finally returned to the apartment, Sarah had some news. She'd been talking to Mrs. Chun, who mentioned that the previous tenant of our apartment, a man named David, had died by suicide in the bathroom. He'd been found in the shower after neighbors reported hearing humming coming from the apartment. For days after they thought he'd moved out. The landlord had never mentioned this when we signed the lease. I moved out the next month. Sarah thought I was being ridiculous, but I couldn't stay there anymore. Even now, 3 years later, I still have nightmares about that humming. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear it coming from my current apartment's bathroom. I've never told anyone the full story until now. The second incident happened about a year later, when I was house sitting for my Uncle Horace while he was out of town on business. He lived in a suburban house about an hour outside the city, surrounded by woods on 3 sides. It was a beautiful property, but isolated. The nearest neighbor was almost a mile away. Uncle Horace had asked me to stay there because there had been some break-ins in the area recently. and he didn't want to leave the house empty. I arrived on a Thursday evening in October. Uncle Harris had left detailed instructions about the alarm system, the locations of all the light switches, and emergency contacts. The house was large, with 3 bedrooms, a finished basement, and an attic that had been converted into a home office. I'd been there many times before for family gatherings, but being alone in such a big house felt different. The first 2 nights were uneventful. I watched TV, caught up on some work, and enjoyed the peace and quiet. But on Saturday night, things started to get strange. I was in the living room reading when I heard what sounded like footsteps in the upstairs hallway. Slow, deliberate steps, like someone trying to walk quietly. I muted the TV and listened carefully. The footsteps continued for about 30 seconds, then stopped. I went upstairs to investigate, turning on every light as I went. All the bedroom doors were closed, just as I'd left them. I checked each room thoroughly, looking in closets and under beds, but found nothing. The attic access was in the hallway, ceiling, and I pulled down the ladder to check up there too. The attic was empty except for some old furniture and Christmas decorations. I went back downstairs, convinced I'd imagined the whole thing. Old houses make noise, I told myself. But as I settled back into my chair, I heard the footsteps again. This time they seemed to be coming from the kitchen. I grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate. The kitchen was empty, but the back door was standing wide open. I was certain I'd locked it before settling in for the evening. I closed and locked the door, checking it twice to make sure it was secure. Then I activated the alarm system, something I'd forgotten to do the previous nights. The beeping of the sensors as they armed gave me some comfort. If someone tried to get in, I'd know about it immediately. But the footsteps continued throughout the night. Sometimes they were upstairs, sometimes in the basement. Sometimes they seemed to be coming from inside the walls themselves. Each time I investigated, I found nothing. The alarm never went off, but I could hear someone or something moving around the house. By morning, I was exhausted and on edge. I called Uncle Harris to tell him what was happening, but he was in meetings all day and didn't return my call until evening. When we finally spoke, he seemed concerned but not entirely surprised. He told me that he'd been hearing strange noises too, especially in the past few months. He'd had the house checked for animals, thinking maybe raccoons or squirrels had gotten into the walls, but nothing was found. He suggested I might want to stay somewhere else for the remaining few nights, but I didn't want to let him down. Besides, I was starting to think the isolation was just getting to me. I decided to tough it out, but I made sure to keep the alarm on and have my phone ready to call for help if needed. Sunday night was quieter, and I began to think the worst was over. I went to bed around 11, leaving a few lights on for comfort. I was just starting to drift off when I heard the front door open. Not the sound of a door being forced or a lock being picked, but the distinct sound of someone with a key opening the door and stepping inside. I heard the alarm system beep as the door opened, but then I heard the beeps that indicated someone was disarming the system. Someone who knew the code. I lay in bed, paralyzed with fear, listening to footsteps in the entryway. Then I heard something that made my heart stop. Someone called my name. It was Uncle Harris's voice, but something was wrong with it. It sounded strained and hollow, like he was speaking through a tube. He called my name again, closer this time, like he was at the bottom of the stairs. I knew Uncle Harris was supposed to be in another state, 3 time zones away. I talked to him just a few hours earlier, and he'd confirmed he wouldn't be back until Wednesday. I grabbed my phone and tried to call him, but the call went straight to voicemail. The voice downstairs called my name again, and I could hear footsteps starting to climb the stairs. I quietly got out of bed and locked the bedroom door, then pushed the dresser in front of it. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and stopped. For several minutes, there was silence. Then I heard the voice again, right outside my door. It was definitely Uncle Horace's voice, but the words were wrong. He kept repeating my name over and over, sometimes in a normal tone, sometimes in a whisper, sometimes almost shouting. Then he started saying other things, fragments of conversations we had over the years, but mixed up and out of context. I called 911, whispering into the phone. The dispatcher said they'd send someone right away, but it would take at least 20 minutes for officers to reach the house. I huddled in the corner of the room, listening to the voice outside my door. Sometimes it sounded like Uncle Horace, but other times it sounded like other people. My father's voice, my grandmother's voice, even my own voice speaking words I'd never said. The door handle turned slowly, and then there was pressure against the door as someone tried to push it open. The dresser held, but I could hear the wood creaking under the strain. The voices continued, now seeming to come from multiple people. They were having conversations with each other, but the words made no sense. They talked about things that had never happened, people who didn't exist, places I'd never been. When the police finally arrived, everything stopped. The voices ceased, and I could hear the officers entering the house, calling out as they searched each room. They found no one. The front door was locked, the alarm system was still armed, and there was no sign of forced entry. They searched the entire house, including the basement and attic, but found nothing. The officers were professional but clearly skeptical. They suggested that maybe I'd been dreaming, or that the stress of staying alone in an unfamiliar house had gotten to me. They filed a report and left, but I could tell they thought I was either lying or having some kind of mental episode. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in the chair by the window, watching the driveway and the tree line, jumping at every shadow. When Uncle Horace called the next morning, I told him everything. He was quiet for a long time, then told me something that made my blood run cold. He said that his father, my grandfather, had died in that house 5 years earlier. Grandpa had been suffering from dementia in his final months, and one of his symptoms was that he would wander around the house at night, calling out for family members. He would have conversations with people who weren't there, mixing up names and memories. Uncle Horace had found him several times standing outside bedroom doors, talking to no one, but what really scared me was what Uncle Horace told me next. He said that in the weeks before Grandpa died, he kept talking about someone who was coming to visit, someone who would stay in the house after he was gone. He would describe this person in detail, but the description was always different. Sometimes it was a man, sometimes a woman, sometimes it seemed to be multiple people. The only consistent detail was that this person knew everyone in the family and could sound like anyone they wanted to. I left the house that afternoon, 2 days earlier than planned. Uncle Horace understood and didn't make me feel guilty about it, but as I was packing my car, I noticed something that made me question everything I thought I knew about what had happened. There were muddy footprints on the front porch, leading from the driveway to the front door. The same size and tread pattern as Uncle Horace's boots, but Uncle Horace was still out of town. I'd talked to him on the phone just an hour earlier, and he'd confirmed he was still in meetings. When I called him back to ask about the footprints, he was quiet for a long time. Then he told me something that made me never want to visit that house again. He said that a few months earlier, he'd come home from work to find his own car in the driveway, but his car was parked exactly where he'd left it that morning, in the same spot. It was as if there were two identical cars. When he looked closer, the second car disappeared, but he found his own footprints leading from where the phantom car had been to the front door. Footprints he couldn't remember making. I've never been back to Uncle Horace's house, and I never will. He ended up selling it 6 months later, claiming he wanted to downsize. But I know the real reason. Some places hold on to things that shouldn't be held on to, and some presences don't know when to leave. The third and final incident happened just last year, and it's the reason I'm finally sharing all of these stories. I was living in a small house I was renting in a quiet neighborhood. My girlfriend Emma had gone to visit her sister for the weekend, leaving me alone. I should have learned by now that being alone at night wasn't something I handled well, but I thought I'd gotten over my fears. It was a Friday evening in March, and I was looking forward to a quiet weekend. I'd rented a few movies, bought some snacks, and planned to just relax. The house was small but comfortable, with a living room, kitchen, 1 bedroom, and a basement that I used as a home office. It was in a safe neighborhood, and I'd never had any problems with the neighbors or security. I was in the living room watching a movie when I heard my phone buzzing with a text message. It was from Emma, but when I looked at the message, my heart started racing. It said, "I can see you through the window." I looked up at the living room window, but the curtains were drawn. I texted back asking what she meant, but got no response. Went to the window and carefully pulled back the curtain to look outside. The street was empty, lit by a few streetlights. Emma's car wasn't in the driveway, and I'd watched her leave that morning. I called her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried texting again, but the messages showed as undelivered. About an hour later, I got another text from Emma's number. This one said, "Why won't you let me in?" I felt a chill run down my spine. I immediately tried calling her again, but still got voicemail. I was about to call her sister when I heard a soft knocking at the back door. 3 gentle knocks, then silence. I went to the kitchen and looked out the back door window. There was someone standing in the backyard, but it was too dark to make out who it was. The figure was about Emma's height and build, but something about the way they were standing seemed wrong. They were perfectly still, facing the house, but I couldn't make out their face. I called out Emma's name, but the figure didn't respond. I turned on the back porch light, but when the light came on, no one was there. The backyard was empty. I unlocked the door and stepped outside, looking around carefully. There was no sign that anyone had been there. I went back inside and locked the door, checking it twice. Then I got another text from Emma's number. This one just said, "I'm cold." I tried calling her sister directly, but didn't have her number saved in my phone. I found her on social media and sent her a message asking if Emma was okay and if she was really visiting. The response came back quickly. Emma's sister said that Emma had never come to visit. She hadn't heard from her in over a week. My heart started pounding as I realized that if Emma wasn't at her sister's house, then where was she? And who was sending these text messages? I tried calling Emma's work friends, but it was late on a Friday night, and most of them didn't answer. The few who did said they hadn't seen Emma since earlier in the week. I was starting to panic, thinking that something terrible had happened to her. Then I got another text from Emma's number. This one said, "I'm in the basement." I felt like I was going to be sick. I knew Emma wasn't in the house, but I also knew that someone was sending these messages from her phone. I grabbed a flashlight and a hammer from the kitchen toolbox and slowly made my way downstairs. The basement was dark and quiet. I turned on the lights and looked around carefully. It was just as I'd left it, with my desk, computer, and some storage boxes. There was no sign that anyone had been down there. I checked behind the furnace and the storage closet, and anywhere else someone might hide. Nothing. I went back upstairs and immediately called the police. I told them that my girlfriend was missing and that someone was using her phone to send threatening messages. They said they'd send someone over to take a report, but it would be about an hour before an officer could arrive. While I was waiting, I got more texts. I'm in the bedroom now. I'm watching you sleep. Why are you ignoring me? Each message made me more terrified. I searched the entire house again, checking every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. I was alone, but someone with. Emma's phone was nearby. When the police arrived, I showed them the text messages. They tried calling Emma's number, but it went straight to voicemail. They searched the house again, more thoroughly than I had, but found nothing. They said they'd file a missing person report and put out a bulletin for Emma, but there wasn't much else they could do that night after the police left. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, jumping at every sound. I didn't want to go to sleep, but I was exhausted from fear and stress. Around 3 a.m, I dozed off in my chair. I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. Another text from Emma's number, but this one was different. It was a photo of me sleeping in the chair, taken from across the room. I could see myself clearly, but there was something wrong with the image. In the background, barely visible in the shadows, there was a figure standing in the doorway. I jumped up and spun around, but no one was there. The doorway was empty. I ran through the house, turning on every light, checking every room again. I was alone, but someone had been in my house, close enough to take a photo of me sleeping. I called the police again, but they said they couldn't send someone out immediately unless I was in immediate danger. I told them about the photo, but they said they'd need to see it in person to verify it. I was on my own until morning. I spent the rest of the night in the kitchen, sitting with my back to the wall where I could see all the entrances. I kept the hammer in my lap and my phone in my hand, ready to call for help. Every few minutes, I'd get another text from Emma's number. Photos of different rooms in the house, all taken from angles that suggested someone was hiding and watching. When the sun finally came up, I packed a bag and left immediately. I went to stay with my friend Marcus, and I called in sick to work. I couldn't function normally after what I'd experienced. Over the next few days, I filed police reports, contacted Emma's family, and tried to piece together what had happened. The police were able to track Emma's phone to a cell tower near my house, confirming that someone with her phone had been in the area that night, but they couldn't find any other evidence of what had happened to her. Her car was found abandoned in a parking lot across town, but there were no signs of a struggle dot. It took 2 weeks. But they finally found Emma. She was in a psychiatric facility, 3 states away, having been admitted under a false name. She'd suffered what doctors called a complete psychological break, and she had no memory of the weeks leading up to her disappearance. She didn't remember sending the text messages, taking the photos, or being anywhere near my house that night. The doctors said that in severe cases of dissociative episodes, people can exhibit behaviors that are completely out of character. They can become fixated on certain people or places, and they can be extremely cunning in hiding their actions. Emma had somehow managed to watch me for hours without being detected, taking photos and sending messages, all while having no conscious awareness of what she was doing. Emma is getting help now, and she's slowly recovering. But she has no memory of that night, and the doctors say she may never remember what happened. Sometimes I wonder if that's for the best. I can't imagine what it would be like to discover that you'd stalked and terrorized someone you loved without knowing it. But what haunts me most about all 3 of these incidents is the pattern I'm starting to see. In each case, someone I knew and trusted became something else. David, the previous tenant who had died, somehow became a presence that knew my name and my routines. Whatever was in Uncle Horace's house could imitate the voices of my family members. And Emma, the person I loved most in the world, became a stranger who could watch me sleep and send me photos from the shadows. I've started to wonder if being alone doesn't just make us vulnerable to external threats, but to something inside. The people we know. something that only comes out when they think no one is watching or when they're no longer entirely themselves. Maybe the real horror isn't what's hiding in the dark, but what's hiding in the people we trust to protect us from it. I still live alone sometimes, but I've learned to be more careful. I check my locks twice, I keep my phone charged, and I never ignore my instincts when something feels wrong. But most importantly, I've learned that the scariest monsters aren't the ones that come from outside. They're the ones that come from the people we know, the voices we recognize, and the faces we trust. And sometimes they don't even know they're monsters at all.